Commander Selaroth of the Veyrath Instructional Corps had reviewed thousands of cadet performance files in her career. She had overseen Xyrelian sprinters, Morvac telepaths, and even a single Duan, a species whose nervous system processed pain signals as musical notes. She believed she had seen everything. She had not seen a human. Cadet Elena Vasquez arrived on orbital station Veyrath 7 at 0600 standard hours, carrying a small bag, a sealed metal case she refused to check, and an attitude that the customs officer later described as disturbingly calm. She was 23 years old, born on the high-gravity colony of Kepler 442b, and she was the first human to be accepted into the Galactic Union's elite first responder cadet program. The program was designed to train field medics for crisis response across Union space. Candidates trained in trauma intervention, biological hazard containment, and multi-species emergency care. Most cadets washed out in the first month. The Xyrelian physiological data modules alone had a 40% failure rate. Elena passed them in 4 days. The training simulation chamber was a marvel of engineering, a sealed room capable of replicating any known planetary environment, flooding with toxins, extremes of temperature, or simulated injury scenarios involving holographic casualties. On the morning of Day 6, Commander Selaroth had arranged a surprise evaluation. She wanted to see how the human performed under pressure. The scenario: a shuttle crash. 2 survivors. 1 Morvac, 1 Duan. Both critically injured. No functioning medical equipment. The cadet would have 60 seconds to assess and 3 minutes to stabilize. Selaroth activated the chamber. What happened next was later reviewed 17 times by the training faculty. Elena entered at a run, already scanning. She assessed both casualties in under 8 seconds, a speed that required the instructors to play back the footage at 40% to understand her methodology. She muttered aloud as she worked, a habit the faculty initially found strange and later recognized as systematic thinking. Duan first, secondary vascular pressure response, I can hear the resonance drop. Morvac shocky but breathing. She then did something that made Cadet Thrix 9, a Xyrelian observer watching through the glass, physically step back from the window. She used her own clothing. Elena tore the sleeve from her uniform without hesitation, twisted it into a pressure bandage, and applied direct manual force to a wound on the Duan casualty's secondary thorax. The wound was spitting fluid, a simulation of what Duan physiology called deep vascular bleed, a condition that, on their homeworld, killed in under 90 seconds without equipment. She had no equipment. She used her hands. Pressure point is here, she said to no one, pressing 2 fingers into a specific location on the Duan's neck, or rather what passed for a neck. I read that Duan have an emergency vascular bypass node. If I hold this, it should redirect circulation to the lower chambers. She held it. The simulation registered a successful redirection. The cadet's physiological knowledge of a non-human species, applied manually in under 30 seconds. She then moved to the Morvac. The Morvac casualty had simulated rib fractures and a punctured secondary lung sac. Elena performed an improvised thoracic decompression using a modified drinking tube from her jacket pocket, a tube she had apparently carried specifically for this kind of scenario, and a small blade she produced from the sealed metal case. The case, it turned out, contained a personal trauma kit she had assembled herself. On Earth, the simulation ended. Both casualties were stabilized. Time elapsed, 2 minutes 41 seconds. The chamber lights came up. Commander Selaroth stood in silence for a long moment. Then she turned to her faculty and said very quietly, "Get me everything on human medical history." Everything. Later that evening, Cadet Thrix 9 found Elena in the mess hall, eating something that smelled aggressively of fermented protein. Thrix was a creature of cautious curiosity, a trait considered unusual among Xyrelians, and he sat across from her with his secondary limbs folded in the posture of formal inquiry. "I watched your simulation today," he said. Elena looked up. "Yeah. You performed vascular bypass redirection on a Duan without instruments. Our textbooks say that requires a minimum of Class 3 surgical equipment. Textbooks are written for people with the right equipment," Elena said. "I trained in the Kepler colony settlements. We didn't have Class 3 anything. You learn to work with what's there. What if nothing is there?" She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that Thrix would later describe in his personal log as deeply unsettling in the most admirable way. "Then you use yourself," she said. "Pressure, temperature, leverage. The human body is a tool. We figured that out a long time ago, back when all we had were our hands and the will to keep someone alive." Thrix processed this. Your species has a very high pain threshold, he said finally. No, Elena corrected. We have a very high tolerance for doing things that hurt, if the alternative is watching someone die. She tapped the metal case sitting beside her tray. Come to the next simulation. I'll show you what I brought. Commander Celeroth, reading the debrief report at 2,200 hours, came to one conclusion. The human was either the most remarkable medical talent she had ever assessed, or humans as a species had survived on a world so hostile that they had spent millennia learning to heal each other with nothing but instinct and determination. After reviewing the geological and historical data on Earth, the ice ages, the plagues, the injuries that would have killed any other known species, she concluded it was both. She approved Cadet Vasquez for advanced track immediately. She also placed a standing order on the entire human catalog of emergency medicine history. There were, it turned out, 37,000 years of it. The jungle was trying to kill them. This was, technically, its default setting. Planet Orith 4 was chosen as a field training location specifically because of its ecological hostility. Fungal spore clouds that disrupted communications, canopy coverage that blocked standard sensor arrays, and a soil composition that corroded most standard-issue medical polymer equipment within 48 hours. It was not the worst environment in the Union training catalog. It was, however, in the top 5. 7 cadets had been dropped at dispersed coordinates at dawn. Their mission was to rendezvous at a central rally point while performing triage on simulated casualties placed at intervals across the terrain. Real injuries could not be simulated safely on Orith 4. The environmental conditions made controlled holoprojection unstable, so the Academy had used a different method. They had used actual trainee volunteers. The volunteers were not seriously harmed, but they wore reactive dermapatch suits that mimicked genuine physiological distress when triggered, elevated cortisol signatures, simulated blood pressure drops, authentic wound sites made visible through pigment injection under the skin. To a field medic's instruments, they were indistinguishable from real casualties. To a field medic without instruments, they were still convincing. Cadet Elena Vasquez found the first one at 0847. He was a Verith cadet volunteer named Pol, and his dermapatch had activated a full arterial bleed scenario on his left leg. The Verith equivalent, which ran along what humans would call the inner thigh, corresponding to the femoral artery in function. The dermapatch read critical. The suit's timer showed he had been bleeding for 11 minutes. Elena's medical scanner had been corroded at the housing seal by the soil. It was displaying nonsense readings. She put it away. Pol, she said, kneeling. Talk to me. Where does it hurt? He looked up at her with wide, multifaceted eyes. Verith had panoramic vision, and in distress, their secondary eyelids closed from the outside in like curtains. 3 of his 6 eyelids were already half shut. My leg. I can feel the pressure dropping. My people, when the deep vessels go, we have maybe 4 minutes before neural cascade. For minutes, Elena repeated. She looked at his leg. She looked at her gear. Her scanner was dead, her polymer bandages had partially degraded, and the arterial pressure on a Verith was roughly twice the human equivalent, which meant standard compression would be insufficient. She took off her belt. It was not a medical belt. It was a standard-issue training harness with tensioning clasps, rated for load-bearing applications. Elena looped it around Pol's upper leg with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed this exact improvisation, threaded the clasp mechanism through itself to create a non-slip anchor, and then used a short branch she snapped from the nearest tree to create a windlass, a twisting mechanism that allowed her to tighten the belt beyond any pressure her hands alone could generate. Pol made a sound. I know, Elena said. It's going to hurt. Tell me when the pressure feeling changes, not when it hurts more, when it changes. Different sensation. What are you doing? Tourniquet. Old technique. Very old. Human field medics used these in wars on Earth hundreds of years ago. Same principle works if the vessel pressure is high enough, which for Verith physiology I'm guessing it is. The windlass gives me mechanical advantage to exceed your arterial pressure with external compression. She turned the stick. What? Twice. Talk to me, Paul. He gasped. Then after the third turn, the sensation, it's different. The pulling feeling stopped. Good. She locked the windlass with a secondary wrap and marked the time on the branch with a small cut. That's the flow interruption. Now I need to get you to the rally point. Can you bear weight? Yes. I think. Then you're walking. I'll take your left side. They reached the rally point 40 minutes later. Elena had found 2 more casualties along the route, a Zyrelian with simulated crush injuries to the secondary thorax, stabilized with a rigid chest compression wrap made from equipment straps and foam padding from the inside of her boot, and a Morvac with spinal instability concerns, whom she had immobilized using a splint improvised from her collapsed tent poles and carried for the last 20 minutes on a drag litter made from her ground sheet. She arrived with all 3 of her casualties alive and stable. She arrived last among the cadets. She had been carrying injured people through a hostile jungle with improvised equipment for 4 hours. The course evaluator, Senior Instructor Jetharak of the Morvac Medical Division, reviewed the sensor logs in silence. He had been in emergency medicine for 40 years. He had trained cadets on 9 planets. He called Elena in for a debriefing. "Your belt?" he said, placing it on the table between them. It was stained with jungle soil and Varith pigment blood simulation fluid. "Explain your reasoning." Elena walked him through it: the physics of arterial pressure, the mechanical advantage of a windlass tourniquet, the historical development of the technique in Earth's pre-technological medical history. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, drawing a quick diagram on the table's surface to illustrate vessel compression mechanics. Jetharak had reviewed human military medical history as part of the Academy's research project. He knew what a tourniquet was. He had not fully understood until this moment that a human could produce one from nothing, in a hostile environment, under time pressure, on a species she had never treated before. "Why did you know Varith arterial pressure would respond to external compression?" he asked. "I didn't know," Elena said. "I estimated. High-gravity species tend to have higher pressure circulatory systems. Varith evolved on a 1.4 G world. The math suggested it would work." She paused. "I've been wrong before. But doing nothing guaranteed he'd die, so I had to try something." Jetharak was quiet for a moment. "You humans," he said at last, "have a phrase. I have read it in your historical medical literature. Something about hands being the first instruments. 'Physician, heal thyself,'" Elena said. "Or something like it. We didn't always have a choice. So we got good at not having a choice." He nodded slowly. Then he marked her evaluation. Perfect score. First in the history of the Orith 4 field exercise. He also submitted a formal recommendation to the Union Medical Standards Board. Review all improvised tourniquet techniques from human military medical archives for cross-species application protocols. The board accepted the recommendation within a week. The first human contribution to official Union emergency medicine protocols was formally logged. A simple stick and a strap, figured out by soldiers in the mud of Earth, centuries before anyone knew there were other species to save. The temperature at Kethmore Training Base was -47 degrees standard. The wind chill brought it lower. The facility was built for environmental extremes training, a dome of hardened composites embedded in the permafrost of Sindaris, a world of perpetual glaciation that the Union used specifically because most species found it nearly uninhabitable. This was, of course, the point. The winter survival module was mandatory for all advanced cadets. It covered thermal regulation, emergency shelter construction, and cold exposure medical response. Most cadets survived it with heated suits and standard insulation gear. A small number each cycle had to be extracted due to physiological distress. No cadet had ever voluntarily discarded their heated suit during the exercise. Until now. The scenario was straightforward in theory. 2 cadets had been separated from their equipment during a simulated shuttle crash. One was injured, a Zyrelian cadet named Vel, whose species had evolved in tropical forest environments and whose thermal regulation was extremely limited. Core temperature drop was already registering critical on the suit sensors. The other cadet was Elena. Elena's heated suit was fully functional. She gave it to Vel. The monitoring team saw this happen and immediately began a heated internal discussion. Was this a protocol violation? A calculated risk? An act of extraordinary sacrifice? Or extraordinary foolishness? Senior Instructor Ketharak called for a pause and debate. "Let's watch," he said quietly. "She knows something we don't." Elena, stripped to her base layer in -47 degrees, moved with brisk efficiency that seemed to contradict the temperature entirely. She began by digging. Not randomly, she had identified a snow bank that was densely packed and angled away from the primary wind direction. Within 12 minutes, using her gloved hands and a folded piece of crashed debris, she had hollowed out a space approximately 1.5 meters by 0.8 meters. A snow trench. An ancient technique. Humans had been building them for as long as they had lived in cold climates. Centuries before technology, long before synthetic insulation. Packed snow, counterintuitively, was an exceptional insulator. The air pockets within it trapped heat. The earth below, however frozen, was warmer than the open air. She lined the interior with layers of emergency foil from the crash kit, reflective side inward. She added a layer of debris, insulating material stripped from the shuttle wreckage. She guided Vel into the space and settled in beside him, pulling a second foil layer over both of them. Body heat, she explained to Vel, who was shivering in cycles now, a Zyrelian physiological distress response that looked alarmingly like a seizure to human eyes but was actually a controlled thermal regulation attempt. You're burning more energy shivering than you're generating. We need to stop the heat loss first, then address the core temperature. Your heating suit, Vel managed. His speech centers were slowing. You gave it to me. You will die. I won't die, Elena said with a certainty that she had clearly calculated, not assumed. Human core temperature management under exposure, we have about 40 minutes before I'm at risk in these conditions with the shelter and the foil. We have a rescue signal active. Rescue time estimate is 22 minutes. She tucked the foil tighter. You had maybe 8 minutes? The math wasn't complicated. They'll process this. You calculated, he said slowly, that my survival window was shorter than your survival window, and made a resource allocation decision. Field triage, Elena confirmed. Works on equipment too, not just injuries. Greatest good, most urgent need. My species got really good at rationing in hard environments. How did you know how to build that shelter? Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind screamed across the glacier. Inside their improvised hollow, the temperature was already measurably higher. Not warm, not safe, but survivable. My grandmother was from a place called Alaska, she said. Northern territory on Earth. Her grandmother taught her how to build a snow shelter. They called it a quinzhee, different from an igloo, faster to make. She taught my mother. My mother taught me. She paused. I grew up on a high-gravity colony, but she made sure I knew the old stuff. Said you never know what world you'll end up on. Ancestral knowledge, Vel said quietly. His shivering was slowing. The shelter was working. Survival knowledge, Elena said. Humans have been cold before. Really cold. For a really long time. We got good at it. The rescue team reached them at 19 minutes, 3 minutes ahead of estimate. The extraction team leader, a Morvac emergency specialist named Joran, opened the foil shelter to find Vel in stable condition and Elena with mild surface frost on her exposed skin but core temperature within acceptable parameters. Joran stood in the entrance of the quinzhee, a human snow shelter built in 12 minutes on an alien ice planet with crashed debris, and was briefly speechless. How? He started. Old technique, Elena said, crawling out. Very old. Back at the base, the monitoring team reviewed the footage. The thermal sensors told the story in clean data. Inside the improvised shelter, the temperature had been stable at -12, 35 degrees warmer than outside, sustained purely by insulation physics and shared body heat. Senior instructor Ketharak wrote a memo that was later distributed to all 17 campuses of the Union Training Academy. The memo was titled, Human Cold Exposure Survival Techniques, Review for Integration. He included at the end a personal note. It read, the human cadet's decision to surrender personal protective equipment to a more vulnerable comrade, while simultaneously constructing viable environmental shelter from available materials, represents a level of adaptive field thinking we have not previously observed in cadet training. This is not improvisation. This is a species carrying 10,000 years of survival wisdom in their muscle memory. We have much to learn. Vel, recovered and warm in the medical bay, wrote a private message to Elena that evening. It said simply, I did not know that knowledge could be inherited like that. That a grandmother's hands could teach a granddaughter's hands across decades, and the granddaughter's hands could then keep a stranger alive on a world neither of them was born on. Elena read it twice. Then she set it aside and began reviewing the next module's prep materials. She had always thought of the quinzhee as just something you knew. She had never quite thought of it as a gift. Even Prime was the jewel of the Galactic Union's infrastructure. A station so large it generated its own atmospheric weather patterns, home to 4.2 million permanent residents and the headquarters of a dozen Union agencies. Its medical training center occupied an entire ring of the station, 16 levels of labs, simulation chambers, lecture theaters, and research archives. It was here that the Union's medical leadership had gathered for a reason that had, in the past 8 months, become something of an institutional fascination, the review of Cadet Elena Vasquez's training record. The gathering was not her evaluation. It was a seminar. The seminar was titled, Deathworld Derived Medical Techniques, Earth Case Study. The room held 47 senior medical officers from 9 species. Elena sat at the front table, beside Commander Selaroth and Senior Instructor Jetharak, feeling slightly like a specimen. The case study that morning was the field splint. The scenario had come from the previous week's simulation, a collapsed structure with multiple casualties. The key casualty was a Vareth officer with a complex fracture of the mid-lobe limb, equivalent to a femur fracture in a human, occurring in a species whose skeletal structure was partially flexible and whose fractures, if allowed to rotate, could produce secondary lacerations to major vessels within minutes. Standard treatment: rigid immobilization with a polymeric splint. Time to apply with proper equipment: 90 seconds. Elena had no proper equipment. She had arrived at the casualty 14 seconds ahead of the nearest supply drop. She had 14 seconds of alone time with a Vareth officer in agony and a fracture that was rotating slowly toward catastrophe. She had used her hands. Not to stabilize the fracture. Human hands alone couldn't generate sufficient and consistent force for Vareth skeletal density. She had done something else. She had found the fracture site by palpation, by feel, and then using the Varetha's own secondary limb, the shorter limb that ran parallel to the injured one, she had applied traction to reduce the rotation, positioning the secondary limb as a natural anatomical reference and binding both limbs together with every strap, cord, and piece of flexible material she had on her person. A living splint. The body splinting itself. The seminar room was quiet as the footage played. The principle, Elena said when the medical officer moderating the session nodded to her, is called buddy splinting. On Earth, when we fracture bones, we've always used adjacent body parts as immobilization references. You tie an injured finger to a healthy finger. You tape injured toes together. You bind a fractured arm against the torso. She paused. I adapted it. Vareth have bilateral parallel limbs on 3 axes. One of those pairs is always structurally sound unless the trauma is catastrophic. I used the sound limb as the stabilizer. How did you know the secondary limb was structurally sound? Asked Physician Commander Vethrael, the senior Vareth medical officer present. His expression was carefully neutral. I didn't, Elena said. I assessed it by palpation first, 17 seconds rough assessment. No crepitus, no abnormal flex response, no pain reaction when I applied mild stress to the midpoint. High probability of structural integrity. Then I used it. And if you had been wrong? Then I would have done something else. She met his eyes. I'm not attached to any particular technique. I'm attached to the patient surviving. Vethrael was quiet. Then he made a gesture that those familiar with Vareth body language recognized as deep respect. The moderator moved to the next case. They reviewed 6 more scenarios over the next 4 hours. Elena walked the assembled medical professionals through improvised wound packing with available fabric, the physiology-based reasoning behind pressure point identification across species, the use of positioning and gravity as passive therapeutic interventions, and a technique she had developed herself, adapting the human recovery position for Zyrelian multilimb anatomy to prevent aspiration in unconscious patients. That last one made Cadet Thrix 9, who was attending as a junior observer, quietly stop breathing for a moment. He had been present when Elena had used it in a simulation 3 months ago. He had assumed it was instinct. He had not known she had designed it. You built a technique, Thrix said during the break, finding her at the refreshment station. Extended an existing one, Elena corrected. Humans have been adapting the recovery position for different body types for centuries: obese patients, pregnant patients, those with spinal injuries. I just extended the logic to a different anatomy. How long did it take you to develop? About an hour. She took a sip of something that smelled strongly herbal. I read the Zyrelian respiratory anatomy module, worked out where aspiration risk was highest, and modified the positioning angles accordingly. Tested it on the simulator before I used it on a person. An hour, Thrix repeated. I had good foundational material to work from, Elena said. Everything I do is based on something humans figured out before me. I'm just applying it to new problems. After the seminar, Physician Commander Vethrael lingered to speak with Commander Selaroth privately. The humans' techniques, he said carefully, are not remarkable because they are sophisticated. They are remarkable because they are simple, elegant, built from first principles with no dependence on technology. He paused. My people developed medical science in parallel with technological development. We never had to invent techniques for when the technology was absent because the technology was always there. Humans, apparently, did not have that luxury. No, Selaroth agreed. They did not. And so they built something we have not, Vethrael said. A medicine that exists below the level of instruments. A medicine of the body alone. He was quiet for a moment. We have something to learn from a species that healed each other with their hands for 10,000 years before they ever reached the stars. Commander Celeroth looked through the glass at Elena, who was already deep in conversation with two junior medical officers, drawing anatomical diagrams on a portable surface, explaining something with the focused patience of someone who had been raised to share what they knew. Yes, Celeroth said. We do. Deep Space Station Meridian 9 was the last station before the border territories, the edge of charted Union space, where the stars grew sparse and the maps grew uncertain. It was staffed by a rotating crew of 400, maintained by automated systems, and hosted a medical facility that was small by Union standards but impeccably equipped. It also hosted the Union Medical Archives Remembrance Ward. The ward was not a hospital. It was a memorial. One wall, floor to ceiling, was dedicated to the documented history of medicine across all Union species. The first surgical interventions, the discovery of germ theory on 40 different worlds, the development of antisepsis, of anesthesia, of triage, of trauma response. It was, in the truest sense, the story of how intelligent species had learned to keep each other alive. Cadet Elena Vasquez stood in front of the human section for a long time. She had been posted to Meridian 9 for her final field rotation. It was an assignment that, 3 years ago, would have been given to a veteran medic. The Union Medical Standards Board had approved it for her specifically, citing her exceptional adaptive capability and demonstrated interspecies emergency response competency. The formal language made it sound administrative. The actual meaning was simpler: they trusted her. The human section of the Remembrance Ward was newer than the others. It had been added 18 months ago, after the seminar at Even Prime. Commander Celeroth had personally overseen its installation. It documented, in careful detail, the history of human emergency medicine from the earliest evidence of wound care, ochre-treated injuries in prehistoric burial sites, field dressings made from plant fiber, fractures that had healed cleanly, indicating some form of immobilization had been applied, through the development of battlefield triage in the centuries of Earth's wars, through the emergence of modern trauma systems, through to the field techniques currently being integrated into Union protocols. Elena read it slowly. She had seen most of it before in one form or another. But seeing it here, in this context, alongside the medical histories of species who had reached for the stars long before humans had learned to fly, it felt different. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned. Vel, the Zyrelian cadet from the ice planet, was standing behind her. He had been assigned to Meridian 9 as well, a coincidence that Elena suspected was not entirely coincidental. You're reading your own history, Vel said. Trying to understand it, Elena said. I grew up knowing this stuff, pieces of it. My mother taught me the Quincy. A field medic who trained at the colony taught me the tourniquet. I learned pressure points from an old medical text that had been reprinted so many times the cover was falling off. She shook her head slightly. I never thought of it as anything special. It was just things you knew. On my world, Vel said, we have a concept. It doesn't translate cleanly, but the closest version is something like the weight of hands. It refers to the knowledge that passes through physical practice. What one pair of hands teaches another pair of hands across generations. Things that are not written down but are carried in the muscles, the instincts. Elena looked at him. Your grandmother's Quincy, Vel continued. It was not in a textbook. It was in her hands. She gave it to your mother. Your mother gave it to you. And you gave it to me, in a manner of speaking, when you used it on Sindaris. He paused. I am alive because of knowledge that was passed hand to hand across generations of your family, across centuries of your species' survival on a world that was trying to kill you. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Later that week, Meridian 9 received an emergency call. A civilian transport had suffered a catastrophic drive failure 70,000 kilometers from the station. 43 passengers, multiple species, 8 confirmed critical injuries. The station's medical team launched in 2 emergency shuttles. Elena was senior medical officer on Shuttle 2. She reached the transport 11 minutes ahead of the station's primary response team. There was a Duan child with respiratory distress, aspiration of cabin debris during the decompression event. Elena performed a manual airway clearance adapted for Duan physiology, a technique she had developed by combining principles from human pediatric first aid with Duan respiratory anatomy, verified over 2 months of simulation work, never before used in the field. It worked. There was a Verith adult with bilateral limb fractures. Elena applied buddy splinting using an adaptation she had refined since Even Prime, now documented formally in Union emergency protocols. Stable in 90 seconds. There was a human passenger, the first she had treated since leaving Earth, a middle-aged man from a colony she had never visited, who was conscious but in shock, with a deep laceration and falling blood pressure. She worked on him last not because he mattered less, but because the others had needed her first. He watched her with wide eyes as she pressed a trauma dressing to his wound with a practiced confidence that he would later describe as, like she'd done it 1,000 times. "Are you a doctor?" he asked. "Almost," Elena said. "Hold this. Pressure. Don't let go." He held it. All 43 passengers survived. The formal report, filed the following day, was reviewed by the Union Medical Standards Board at their next quarterly meeting. The board's chairperson, Physician Grand Commander AOL, read the case notes with the careful attention she gave every critical incident review. She had been in medicine for 60 years. She had reviewed thousands of incident reports. She called Commander Selaroth after reading this one. "The Duan child," AOL said. "The airway clearance technique. Is that in our protocols?" "It is now," Selaroth said. "Vasquez submitted the documentation last month. Board approved it 2 weeks ago." AOL was quiet. "Then, how many human-derived techniques are currently integrated into Union emergency protocols?" Selaroth pulled up the file. 14 formally integrated. 22 under review. Another silence. "And this from a species," AOL said slowly, "that has been in the Union for 11 years. That has been in space for less than 200, Selaroth corrected gently. "Yes." AOL was very quiet. "And how long did they spend on their own world, learning how to keep each other alive with their hands?" "The archaeological record suggests," Selaroth said, "approximately 300,000 years." The call was silent for a long moment. Then AOL said something that Selaroth wrote down and kept. "We thought we were welcoming a new species into our archive of knowledge," she said. "It seems they brought an archive of their own." On Meridian 9, Elena Vasquez filed her last cadet report, packed her sealed metal case, still containing the trauma kit she had assembled on Earth, still replenished and maintained, because old habits from hard worlds did not leave you, and stood one more time in front of the remembrance ward. She looked at the human section. She looked at the centuries of desperate, determined, hand-worn knowledge recorded there. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the Quincy in the snow. She thought of 43 people who were alive today. Then she picked up her bag and went to find out what came next.